What if the whole idea of loving your body or loving yourself, compassion, is just not happening? If it feels inauthentic, if the voice in your head that criticizes you, that says you're worthless, that says you're a failure, if you believe that voice deep down, you admit that you believe that voice and you're not ready to love yourself. What do you do? How do you think about it? So that's the topic of this video. I'm Jared. I'm a former binge eating wrestler, and I turned a Zen monk for 13 months to work on my own food and emotional attachment issues. And now I help people with overeating to stop the sabotage and develop sustainable, healthy eating habits. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Be sure to subscribe. It really helps out. Without further ado, let's dive in. I'm going to be exploring this topic using two stories about masks. And the first story is going to be about Leonardo DiCaprio playing the good king and bad king in the Iron Mask. Now, on that image up there, the bad king is on the right, and the mask is actually Leonardo's twin brother, who is the rightful good king, who is locked in a basement with a mask over his face. Now, I'm going to be blending metaphors and analogies here, so bear with me. This stuff about perfectionism and all this different stuff, it's complicated. So I'm going to be using different metaphors, and the other metaphor, again, using a mask, is going to be the Jim Carrey mask, who, when he puts it on, his whole personality changes. Now, before I go into the masks, I also want to put in context where you're at if you're struggling with perfectionistic thoughts, shame thoughts, etc. And as you can see, I put up a little triangle about where someone is at on their journey. And at the top, it's the cues. This is why we write. If you're new to this channel, we write before we eat. We write with awareness, feelings, and thoughts. And that is to catch the automatic cues. So that's the first layer. And then another layer down is when we're getting into the thoughts, right? And so this is where you're at if you are struggling with the perfectionistic thoughts. And after we get through these thoughts that are kind of like blocking and we get into the inner kid, that's when we can really, really heal. But in order to really, really heal, we need to get through these blockages, these thoughts that are masking our true selves. So let's explore the stories for some insights. Let me just recap the story real quick with Leonardo DiCaprio. Very, very quick. Leonardo is a bad king. He's selfish. He's horrible king. He feeds rotten food to his people. And he locked away his twin brother, who is compassionate and wise, in a basement. Now, Leonardo, the bad king, did this to sort of protect the dynasty because they couldn't have two kings warring over the throne. So sort of it was do it to protect. And so how this ties in is because oftentimes we are like our true selves are like the king in the basement. We are locked away. We cannot see the world. And there's this despot. There's this evil king. There's this inner critic who is ruling up top and who has all the control. And this is where the other concept of the mask comes in. And truth be told, we identify with the mask. We think we are the mask. In the movie with Jim Carrey, the mask takes over his personality. He becomes the mask, right? And so it's really important just to note that if the inner critic thoughts seem true, you're at the second layer. You're identifying with your ego consciousness. Your ego consciousness, the shame voice, it developed when you were a kid. As a kid, if your parents weren't there for you, you would blame yourself. For example, for me, I was neglected, so I blamed myself. I'm not lovable enough. Kids do this all the time. Young kids, if the parents get divorced, totally not the kid's fault. The kid blames themselves. So kids internalize conflict and they create these shame narratives. And these shame narratives actually help a kid survive. The kid, it's not the parents' fault, although it is, but the kid, for them to, the kid needs to believe that the parents are there for them. So they will internalize that it's their fault. So the ego consciousness is from your childhood. And at the current stage of where you're at now is that you're wearing the mask, and the mask is you. The mask is you. And so how do we take this mask off, right? If you say things like, oh, I love you, or oh, you're worthwhile, if you're wearing a mask, the mask is like, no, you're a piece of shit. The mask is like, no, you're worthless. And so these compassion and love, it all falls short. It all feels inauthentic. And saying things like, oh, I love you, body, it just doesn't resonate. And so I'll share some examples about how we can now go out of this second layer and start going into the third layer, the inner kid, getting through these obstacles. And in a nutshell, we have to realize that the mask, right? The ego consciousness that was developed as a kid, the mask gives you tunnel vision, right? If you think about a mask, right? You can't really see out of it. You can't see, right? And if you think about when you started putting on this mask, young child, middle school, maybe high school, whenever, your brain wasn't fully developed. And so when this mask takes over, it's the brain of whatever age you put it on. And its perception is limited. It sees things in black and white, yes or no, success or failure. It bases all your worth on your weight. It doesn't see anything else. It's sort of blind. In many ways, it's blind. And so we don't want to fight the mask. We do not want to fight the mask. Paradoxically, what we want to do is actually see the mask's whole perception. We want to see the mask. We want to agree with the mask. If the mask is saying you're a worthless piece of shit, one little technique is to agree with the mask, right? To not fight the mask, to not disagree, nothing. You agree with the mask. You say, because this is how you really feel. This is currently where you're at. You do feel like a piece of shit, right? So you agree with that. That's the truth. That's where you're at right now. You say, I am a piece of shit, but you say, I'm a piece of shit for the most part, but ... And when you say for the most part, what you're doing is you're helping, you're seeing how the mask, when you say for the most part, it's like you go, oh, the mask kind of comes off. It's like you start taking off the mask. You start seeing, oh, I'm 99% a piece of shit, but there's 1% that is not a piece of shit because I'm not an entirely worthless person. I'm not in. Another little technique is where you challenge if the voice is certain or a possibility. So this again is the same basic technique. Let's say the voice says, you know what, you're unlovable. No one is ever going to love you because you're big. Well, let's apply this technique. One, we see the thought, right? And we can say but I have some friends who are bigger as well, and they're in relationships, so you can challenge it that way, widening the perception. So these are ways, because when that inner critic it's speaking in, this is absolute, it is going to happen, this is fact. And that's the mask that is blocking your perception. It's the ego consciousness that you're identified with. It's the kid who is kind of taking over, the frightened child who's trying to protect you. That's where this ties in. As a kid, this voice actually sort of protected you, and giving up this voice it's going to be a little scary. But we don't have to give up that voice just yet. It's not like we just suddenly remove that voice. What we do instead is we kind of loosen the mask, right? We challenge the voice with facts. Is it helpful or not? How does it make us feel? And when we get this other data, when we think about if it's a possibility or certainty, if it's for the most part, but dot, 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 if it's helpful, these questions help release sort of the perfectionistic, the rigid mask, right? This is about discovering your authentic voice. And when you take off the mask, it is the next layer, sort of going deep. When you start taking off that mask, that next step is to then hear the tone of the inner critic. Is it scolding? Is it manipulative? Is it contemptuous? Is it disgusting? What's the tone? And can you talk to it? Can you talk back? Right? Because when you start talking back, that's like when you're really starting to create separation between the mask, your false self, and and who you are. Um, and eventually, this separation becomes bigger, and the voice starts to shift a little bit, and you can start to connect a little bit more with that inner kid. And that inner kid is really where the healing ultimately comes from. But that shame voice can be so sticky and so hot and so um, it can block your progress from going down into the healing the inner kid relationship. So I hope this video makes a bit of sense and resonates with you. If it does, be sure to like, spread the message out, and thanks so much for your time. Okay, namaste.